Good evening, everybody. Hello, welcome, and welcome back to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really glad to be with all of you here this evening. Happy New Year. Off to a not inauspicious start, I would say, but here's to hoping that we can bring better times our way. Please say hello in the chat. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's with us in the room. Let us know your name and where you are. The chat is also where you can add your questions during our conversation, and I will try to bring them in later in the program. A few words about JWA. We are a digital archive that works to transform the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present, and we do this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps to create a better world. So, thank you for being our partners in this effort. Book talks are just one piece of the work that JWA does. So please, I invite you to check out jwa.org to explore all the different projects and resources that we have to offer. A quick logistical note, if you are looking for captioning, you can click on the button that says CC or Show Captions, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and that will turn them on for you. Okay, wonderful to see people saying hello. I am delighted to introduce this evening's author. Clare Kinberg is the publisher and editor of the Washtenaw Jewish News, a monthly newspaper in Southeast Michigan, and she was the editor of the International Literary Political Biannual Bridges, a Jewish feminist journal from 1989 to 2011. For many years, she worked as a librarian and teacher and as a director of religious schools in various Jewish denominations. Clare has been an organizer in the lesbian, feminist, and anti-war movements for more than 40 years, and she recently published By the Waters of Paradise, an American story of racism and rupture in a Jewish family, which we will be discussing tonight. Welcome, Clare. So glad to have you here with us.
Glad to be here.
So, this is a really interesting book. It is a memoir, but it is focused not, your life isn't necessarily the life that is fully at the center of it, but it's really about the search for the story of your Aunt Rose. Can you tell us where this story began for you?
Well, the story began when I was young because I there was a vague notion that I had another aunt that was never talked about. But it wasn't until 2016 when I found her death certificate on the internet that I realized that and found that she lived like 2 hours away, that she had lived two
Mm.
hours away from where I was living in Michigan. That the idea that I actually could find her community and find out about her became like something very tangible for me.
Yeah, it was interesting to see how throughout the story you're sort of almost sort of I guess it's not really correct to say circling one another, but in some ways, as you're researching her story, you're finding all these different places where your two stories kind of met and what you were looking for. And you write that you had the feeling at certain points that you had become a writer in part to tell Rose's story. Why did it feel so urgent for you to know more about Rose?
Um, well, I had been an editor and an occasional writer of a few essays and different pieces over the years. But I had, I knew a lot of writers. I thought a lot about writing. I've been an avid reader my whole life. But when I found her community that she had lived in for the last 40 years of her life, from 1943 till she died in 1982, um, my adopted African American children were teenagers. And I been had done a lot of searching for the right place to live for our family to for our children to grow. And I when I found the community that she had moved to, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to tell her story because it did intersect with mine, and I knew that, and I wanted to know more about the place that she had found to live, how she got there, why she stayed,
And what was
and
oh, sorry, go ahead. I
no,
didn't mean
no,
to.
go ahead.
Um, it was clear from the book. I mean, even just from saying that you started it, 10 years ago, basically, the research in earnest, it was a long research process and not and one that wasn't simple. Tell us a little bit about the process and how you pursued the story.
Well, I'm a real breadcrumb follower. So one thing leads to another. And I love to do research. I'm a librarian. And um, I, it's when I come across something like this place where she lived, Vandalia, Michigan. Um, I found that it had a remarkable history, and that places around it had remarkable histories. Idlewild, um, Michigan was a really famous Black resort and entertainment center that's not very far from Chicago. And that led from one thing to another, just the history of the place that was of Vandalia, which had been settled before the Civil War um, by um, abolitionist Quakers, and also um, Africans American slaves who had escaped, and other free blacks, and it led to histories of the Civil War, and it was just one thing led to another, and um, I love doing research, so I could have just kept on. I'm still researching some of the topics in the
Mm,
book, but at some point you have to say, okay, this part of the book is finished.
right. So tell us some of the discoveries you made and tell us about your Aunt Rose, because I think it's important to have a sense of who she was and how you pieced those pieces together.
Well, yeah, well, she was my father's had there was 7 siblings in the family, and she was born in 1907 in St. Louis. All of my father and his siblings were born in St. Louis. But both of their parents were born in Eastern Europe. And um, and my father's family was very close knit. Um, so that it was quite shocking to me that he had another sister who wasn't talked about. I mean, in my father's family, he had one sister, Tilly, who lived alone her whole life, and she called quite a bit. She was kind of needy. If she called at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning because a light bulb had burned out, my father went over to her house and
Mm,
changed the light bulb for her, and that was very typical of the way that they interacted. So that was why it was shocking to find that he had this other sister that was never talked about. Um, she was she was the first to marry, and she was 17 when she married. The following day, their father had a heart attack, had an aneurysm,
mm.
and died. Um, and so the family was completely changed after that because it was 7 children, and their mother didn't speak English and didn't work outside the home. So um, everybody in the family started working except for the ones who were too young. Their youngest um, brother, I think, was 6
Mm.
when their father died. And she had a child, which she was adopted by another aunt, and she, disappeared from the family around the early 1930s. And I think that they knew where she was, but had very, very little contact with her for the rest of her life. And um, that it wasn't, it's publicized, that it was a family secret. And it's not so much the secret. It's that it was an exclusion. She was outcast. And very little was known. I don't think that I don't think that anybody knew when she died. And her obituary said that she had a family somewhere, but she didn't really know where.
But they also didn't ever speak of her again, right? I mean, and
Right.
you
But,
talk about having heard some mention of her, but it like didn't compute. And so you just kind of like forgot about, right? Like you sort of were like, this doesn't make any sense. In the way that human memory can work, where if we can't quite make sense of something, we shut it in a room and we don't think about it again.
right. I didn't, it really did not, I would not have said that he had another sister, although I knew that he had seven siblings. I mean, there was seven siblings. He had six siblings. So, but I didn't ever put that together. And when my father died in 1975, when I was 20, she was listed as a sibling
Hmm.
in his obituary. So there she was. So,
Interesting.
but it was a complete mystery. A very, was something that called to me because it was a mystery in a way.
Hmm. Right. The sort of maybe not a secret, but such a deep silence that it echoes in some deep
Yeah.
way.
Yes.
And so what did you learn about you know, where her journey had taken her and what do you see as the root of where, why this rupture happened with her family?
Um, well, she married an African American man, and I think that that's as the story that when my father died, one of his sister-in-laws, my his brother's wife, said, well, she married she ran off with a black man, and then that was it for her with the family. So I sort of knew that that was their story,
Hmm.
um, but I wanted to know the story from her point of view. That's what really drove me to find out more. How would she tell this story? What was it like from her point of view? What they moved from Chicago. I found them in the 1940 census. Once I found her last name,
Hmm.
I could do that was the the doorway into finding out her life. It's so frustrating with doing research on women that
Yeah.
where you don't know what their names are. Um, but when I found what her last name was, it was very easy to find much more. That was really the doorway. And I found them, living in Chicago in 1940, and then found where they had moved after that. And that, was really interested me on so many levels. 1940 was the beginning of World War II. It was such a calamitous time for Jews, and there she was, sort of without any connections to her family,
Hmm.
and living in the south side of Chicago in an entirely black neighborhood because segregation was it was the year that they were there was the year that Lorraine Hansberry's father won the Supreme Court decision, I think it was, to be able to move into a what had been a restricted white area,
Hmm.
so that segregation, complete, very strict segregation was the rule in Chicago, and there was very few interracial couples. But that led me to reading Black Metropolis, which was, a major history book or sociological history from right in that period, and the authors had there was one chapter about interracial couples, um, in which they had interviewed. They estimated that there was 340 some odd interracial couples living in Chicago, and they interviewed like 140 of them, which is just
Wow,
astounding.
that is impressive.
Yes. Um, so that chapter was just like so interesting to me. It brought me so close to their lives, and yet there was such a veil between me and her. I didn't really know. I didn't have anything that was really about my Aunt Rose, so I just kept learning and researching and studying all of the things around her.
Hmm. One of the things that I thought was an interesting way that you tried to not just research, but where you couldn't fill in the details with hard facts, um, you kind of imagine some narration. You sort of imagine yourself into the missing pieces, right? So, and one part you say sort of like, I listen for echoes within to imagine Aunt Rose. So you sort of like create these, in some cases, narrations as if she's telling her story. In some cases, you're just imagining possibilities like how she and Mr. Arnwine might have met. Um, how did you approach that piece of the writing, and or that piece of the process of creating Rose's story?
Well, I'm not a historian, and so I gave myself a lot of freedom to approach the story that I was trying to tell in many different ways. So I tried. I wanted so much to know what she was thinking. So I would just I'm living with her pictures and stories, the little pieces that I can find of her, um, and stories that I had heard. One of my cousins did not remembered Rose coming to their apartment in Chicago a few times and talking about her life. And so I had this little piece that she had gone to Chicago and was talking about her going to visit her son Joey in St. Louis. So I had heard that happened. So I just you know tried to evoke as much as I could. And I had spent so much time with her sisters, my Aunt Gertie and my Aunt Laura, my Aunt Tilly, growing up, and they were all very individual. They weren't, they weren't the same, but they did have a style of talking.
Mm.
And so I just imagined that she, had that same something, something similar. I felt like I could get inside of her. And so I
Mhm.
just tried. Um, I don't know, there's two sections where I do that in the book and, kind of write in her voice. Um, I hope that they work. They were important for me to in writing the book to just try to imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you get a sense of sort of how you're growing in some way, like growing close to her by doing that, or by, thinking about where your own stories connect. Um, so there's something that comes out of it, not only of her story, but also of that, the part of what writing this kind of book, I imagine, is about is like trying to build that bridge to what you don't know. And so you see the kind of the piece of that as well. There's a question in the chat about sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, and then we can go to that question, but I was just going to say that through writing in very many places while I was writing the book, I realized that I was telling the story as I wanted to tell it, that it was more, even her story was more telling about myself than, um, than her, because I'm really, I didn't know. So the things that I was interested in her life were the things that I was interested in. And someone else, she would certainly tell her own story differently, and someone else who was in the family might tell her story completely differently. Um, and so, even I talk a lot about my own story in the book, but even when I'm telling her story, it's about me.
Right. Well, I
So,
would say that that's always true in any book that someone writes. It is largely about why it is that they need to tell the story, and then they're going to tell it through that lens. And you're quite open about that in the book. And I think that that adds a certain kind of richness of seeing that kind of yearning that that exists of like why someone's story matters. Not only because they're a relative and not only because it's unknown and so therefore it kind of calls to you as like a missing piece, but also because you had a sense that, and like you sort of ask I think at the beginning of the book, like, how would my life have been different if I had known that she existed? How would my life as someone with a multiracial family have been different to know there was someone else in my family who'd had that experience? I mean, in a different time and
yes,
place, so it was
yes,
different, but
yes,
that would have been meaningful, and that maybe also it would have been meaningful for her to know that you were going to be part of this family too, and your family would be another piece of the Kinberg family.
yeah, yeah. Those are all really important to me.
Yeah. There was a question that I just wanted to clarify, a question from Ronnie. You talk about how, from her first marriage, which was not the marriage to Mr. Arnwine, the African American man, there was already this kind of sense that she had like killed her father in some way by getting married because he died the next day, and that she was blamed. Um, so does that suggest, I think what Ronnie's sort of asking is like, does that suggest that there was already some sense that she was like different or dangerous or somehow already played a kind of troubled piece in the family?
Well, that was sort of my extrapolation from the facts. I mean, there was
Hmm.
two things that I knew. I didn't know that their father had died um, before the next day after her marriage until I found her marriage license, or some recording of their marriage. Um, and then and it was just the date, and then the next day, was the death. And so I knew that those two things had happened. And I knew that the raising of her son, that he had been put into an orphan's home, and that the family, he had gone to from house to house, and different members of the family were taking care of him, and that so that was like a point of tension in the family. So I put those two things together, that their father had died the day after her wedding, and that her son was that she wasn't caring for her son, and other people in the family were. um, to then I imagined what was going on in the family, that it must have been um, a lot of tension, and some blaming there. And then I also found the third piece of evidence was that I found after I had been writing the book for 6 years, that one of my aunts had kept a diary in the year of 1933. It was very brief, but she did mention in it that Aunt Rose had sent, wasn't living with the family, but she had sent a Valentine's card to her younger siblings, and that they were not supposed to talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
So but then everything else from the feelings, and how that when and how all of that I just imagined from those pieces of information that I found.
Hmm. Some of the things you found were photos, and I think it's always nice if we're going to talk about Rose. Let's take a look at some of the photos that you have of her. Hold on a second here. Let me.
I found in doing family research that there's often just one or two people in a family who like really are the keepers of photos and are interested in the past. So this was the first photo of Rose that I found. My aunt Laura, who was the oldest of the seven siblings, um, when she passed away, all of her photos went to her um, great granddaughter, her great granddaughter, um, and she looked through the photos for me and found this one. And on the back of this photo, it says Rose.
And
But
what year
what?
is it from? Do you know?
No, I had to just I don't know, but it looks like it's from the 1920s.
Yeah. She looks quite glamorous.
Yeah, she's young and she has very soulful eyes and nice dark wavy hair.
Right. Her hair is bobbed. She has sort of fur trim on her dress.
Yeah, it's a studio photo,
Yeah.
and that's on there, Schweig in St. Louis. But other than that, it really drew me in. It was, fascinating to find. I had no idea what she looked like before this photo was, sent to me.
Hmm. And then you also later in your research found a photo of her when she was older.
This photo was among in my mother's scrapbook after she passed away. I went through it, and I think that I might have seen this photo before because I looked through my mother's photos before, and I know that my aunt Mary is the woman with the handbag because she was a known person to me. She's my great aunt Mary, but I don't know that I ever really questioned who was the other woman.
Hmm.
Um, and then I between the date and I just now I know that it is Aunt Rose, but this is the only other photo I have of her.
Mm. And then as part of your research, you searched really high and low to find people who had met Rose or who were related to people who'd been important in her life. So tell us about this photo and that process of
Yeah.
searching
Well,
for
so
people who were connected with her.
when I found her death certificate on the internet, it said that the cemetery where she was buried. It listed the cemetery where she was buried, which I found that on the internet, and there was several like 40 photos of different gravestones from the cemetery, and they were all taken by Marshall Sanders, who's the person. Well, I'm on the far left of this photo, and on the far right is Marshall. And it had his email address. So I wrote to him and said, I think that my aunt is buried in the cemetery that you've taken photos of. And he wrote back and said, well, that's possible, but it is an African American cemetery. So maybe she might be buried somewhere else. But I found that she was indeed buried in the cemetery that he had taken the pictures of, and his parents are buried there, and his grandparents, and he and his wife Sharon, who I'm standing next to, um, already have like engraved. They're very into genealogy, and so
Mhm.
they've have their headstones there already with their
Wow.
whole genealogy engraved in the back. We visited many times. I mean, I couldn't have written the book without Marshall and Sharon's support and information and connections. They took me through the Cass County African American cemeteries a few times. They go and visit Aunt Rose every year. Um, and through the cemeteries, they told me many stories just about the history of the place
Hmm.
because Marshall's family goes back to the very founding in the 1830s. Um, and then in the middle there is his brother Maurice, and then the rest are their children and their partners and grandchildren.
And so How did it help you put the story together to meet people who had known Rose?
Well, I became very enamored of the place where they lived. Um, Marshall's actually grew up in Detroit, but he went to back to Vandalia every summer, and he is a storyteller. His mother and his grandmother and other people in his families, like telling the stories of the history of that place, is very important to them. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and the Underground Cass County Underground Railroad Society, something like that, has a research facility there. It's a house, and that has archives in it. And the history of the place is just so important, and it was such a crossroads of Native American history, abolitionist history, um, African American history, and it's kind of an under the radar place. It wasn't really well known, and it still isn't really well known. But it to the people who live there kind of know this history in a such a personal way. Um,
And it seems,
and and Aunt Rose was an outsider to that, but she stayed there for 40 years. And that question of why she stayed even after her divorce in 1957 um, was a driving question for me. Like, what about this place kept her there?
mhm. Right. You get a strong sense of the community and that was important to her. And she left her house there to friends of hers from that community.
Right. Who are still living, the same family, descendants of that same family are still living in the house.
Yeah. There's one more picture we have, which is of you and your dad. And I'm going to ask you to read a little piece of the book that will help bring your dad, who
Right.
who is an important character in the book as well, as a kind of other pole in some ways to Rose's story in your family.
Right. So it's one of while I was writing the story, it was I kept inquiring of myself, why is this story so important? Why do I need to tell this story? And it comes. I want to read the section. It's actually there's an introduction in the book that's like 20 pages long, but then this is chapter one. It's called My Life in Rose's Absence. So I'm going to read the first few pages of that. In the fall of 1960, when I was 5, which is about when this picture was taken, I sat with my parents watching the televised debates between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. I could sense something consequential was happening. I felt, but did not understand, an unsettling tension emanating from the TV into our family's living room. Some sort of change was in the air. My father was planning a move. Our home in the Jewish enclave of University City outside of St. Louis was a 3-story painted white stucco built in 1908 in a neighborhood that was part of the 1904 World's Fair expansion. The 50-year-old home felt grand to me, to my child self. It had a wraparound porch with 4 bedrooms on the second floor and 2 attic bedrooms on the sloped ceiling third floor. I had my own bedroom, and my mother's mother lived with us, which meant 2 of my brothers had to share a room. The neighborhood kids played hide and seek in multiple backyards until after dark, when we could hear our moms calling for us from our front porches. I understood from overheard adult conversations that we were moving because Black families had moved nearby, too close for my father's liking. My father wanted to be ahead of the curve, not taking any chances that I or my remaining school age brother Bob might be in social situations with Black classmates. The 1960 yearbook for University City High School the school that my three eldest brothers attended, showed no African American students in the senior class out of a total of over 500 students. Even in 1969, when there were 60 Black graduates out of a class of 600, one of the Black students, Judy Gladney, described her experience as being a black drop in a sea of white. Her father, a physician, had been the first to integrate the gated University Hills neighborhood in 1965. My family moved out of a nearby neighborhood in the summer of 63, in the first wave of white flight from University City. My parents bought into a newly built subdivision in an unincorporated area near Creve Coeur, Missouri. We would drive out to the plot of land on the edge of the city between newly paved streets and semi-rural farmland. We watched as the house was built, from poured concrete foundation to freshly sodded lawns. On January 14th, 1963, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel had been in Chicago, speaking at the invitation of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at a landmark national
Patty.
conference
Uh-uh.
on religion and race. Even though no one I knew was at the conference and I was too young to even be aware of it, the civil rights movement that the conference helped build was dramatically changing the course of history. Even the private relationship between me, a 10-year-old white Jewish girl, and my 52-year-old father was fundamentally changed by this historic course correction. Rabbi Heschel, a prolific theologian, philosopher, activist, was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907, the same year as Rose. He had just finished writing his doctoral dissertation, The Prophetic Consciousness, in Berlin in 1933, when the Nazis began passing laws restricting all manner of Jewish life. After he immigrated to the United States in 1940, he applied his deeply informed social conscience to America's civil rights movement. In his opening address at the Religion and Race Conference, Heschel said, and I quote, "Racism is worse than idolatry. Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking." Not the end of quote. Not long after my family settled into our new home, 30 miles from the city, I was riding in the front seat of my father's Buick LeSabre, accompanying him to work on a Saturday morning. In this memory, I see myself as about 10 years old. My father's used machinery warehouse, Rodell Equipment, located in an industrial part of downtown near the Mississippi River, was a 45-minute drive from our home. I loved it when my father occasionally took me to work with him. The huge, grimy machines, some rising to the 10-foot ceilings, scared and thrilled me at the same time. His workplace was a world apart. On the route, my father drove through a residential Black neighborhood in the city, and I was consumed by sadness and indignation. Peering out from the Buick's window at the worn red brick houses, some with boarded windows, I wanted to turn to my father and say, "How can you drive through this neighborhood day after day and just accept that other human beings are living in conditions so much poorer than our own?" But just at that moment, my father locked the car doors and opened the glove compartment to allow easy access to a handgun that he, unbeknownst to me at the time, kept there. That was the moment I lost my father, and my father lost me. Something shattered in my young heart. How could I love and trust someone who witnessed this inequity each day as he drove to work with no apparent affliction to his soul? His commitment to our safety did not make me feel safe. I needed to know that the evil of racism was as apparent to him as it was to me. My father's approach to our family's safety unmoored me from the world I had known. I never found the words to ask him about that moment, to tell him how it affected me. Although I became disconnected from my father at a young age, I soon found an anchor via the nightly news in civil rights and, and the anti Vietnam War protests of the mid 60s. These reports revealed that I was not alone, that I was but one drop in a sea swell of change. Even though the Black protesters were strangers to me, what they were doing was the only thing that made sense to me, the only way I could imagine living in a world of such inequity.
Thank you. Um, I I appreciated the way you were able to bring in your father as a different piece of the presence, and I think it also that piece that you read raises one of the questions you ask, I think towards the end of the book about that also kind of speaks to why you wrote this story, which is, you know, sort of as an act of repair, somehow trying to repair the damage. And I think, I mean, I guess I can ask you what damage you meant. I assumed you meant both a kind of the familial damage of the losing a family member entirely, and also the larger damage that was caused by that. But am I reading that correctly?
Well, it was just that the it was there was echoes of this. I tried to understand what made my father want to keep us so separate from other Black people in St. Louis. And um, that this story of what happened with Rose just seemed like the to be a root to the root of it.
Hmm.
And that I wanted to just keep exploring, that. What is this root? Why was he like this? And I just felt connected to, um, what that his sister, the family conflict that happened around his sister,
Hmm.
and that it was so that the civil rights movement was really, in people's face. It was like really making change happen in 1963, and before and after that. Um, so it just affected us all. It was a change that was affecting everybody and in different ways.
And there's a comment in the chat from Rachel saying that they were among the first Jewish families moving into University City after the exodus of whites from there. So, there's so many different pieces to the story and different experiences.
Yes, and I really I hope that my telling this personal story will encourage other people to tell their own story, which will be different, from mine, but will help us understand, more of what did happen, and more what's, all of the echoes are still we're still living with them.
Absolutely. We're still, as you say, we're still trying to repair the the ruptures that have happened in Jewish communities and Jewish families, and in the larger American society, obviously. Um, there's another part of the story that you write about that you say was hard to come to terms with, and that is, and you sort of say this is a part of the story I didn't want to tell, which is the story of Rose's abuse at the hands of her husband. Um, what was it like to discover that and then figure out how to tell that part of the story?
Um, I there was that 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 she was abused by him was something that I knew from early on because that was the cousin who said that she would come to Chicago to talk with said that said she was very upset and that she was that she was in an abusive relationship, and I knew that. And then when I found their divorce decree, it said that he was I you don't divorce decrees are put into legalized language, whatever it has to say, but it did say that this is cruel and unusual punishment, not cruel and unusual punishment, but acts of cruelty. Um, and but I knew that there was so many points of violence in both of their lives. Um, from the he was born in 1900 and in Texas, and then grew up in Oklahoma, and the just the um, brutality all around um, was something that was part of their lives. And so I didn't see, I did see their relationship as just um, as part of that.
Hmm.
Um, and I just had to um, fill out his story um, beyond being like a stereotypical abusive Black man. That was so I luckily did find out a lot more about his life, and that was I was grateful to be able to to understand or to be able to write more about aspects of his life.
Right, to give a richer picture of who he was. Um, and you also learned some things about sort of the um, the kind of fluid nature of racial classification and racial identity from Rose's story. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, um that was a very revealing thing about just um, society in America. Um, that well, when she was on the census, she's listed as Black in when she lived in Chicago, because everyone in her building was listed as Black. So she was just, that's who she was. But then I looked at, at many census um, of her neighbors and people who were living in Vandalia who were all, multiracial. Um, and it was part of it. It was part of my own family's history, that because my wife is descended of Creoles from Louisiana, and her grandmother came north to pass. So on in in the earlier censuses of her family, they're listed as either mulatto or colored or Black or white, depending on where they were and who was taking the census and who was writing down the facts. Um, and it just, when you put it all together, it was just so clear that it was that race is just, it's something that's um, in the it's contextual. It's
Right.
just and it matters a lot because it was like it had to be recorded. Like, people had to be classified as one race or another, and the laws affected people differently depending on what race they were classified as. But the same person could be classified differently in different contexts.
Right. Yeah. It is
That
so
is how
interesting.
racism works.
Um, And then, of course, the fact that she chose to stay and live the rest of her life in this Black community also speaks to her own sense of how her own racial identity may have shifted in various ways, or who she chose to claim as her people.
Yes. So that I don't know. Yeah, I wish that I could. That's one of the, you know, I wish that I could talk to her and know what she thought about any of this, and whether the language that I use would make any sense to her at all. It might
Mhm.
be not how she thought about it at all, but definitely that community became her people, and that really does make it makes me reflect a lot on um, who are my people and what
Mhm.
that means, and I while I was just finishing the book, I um, came across that Audre Lorde, a quote from Audre Lorde about, um, I don't have it in front of me,
I
but
have it in front of me. I wrote it down
yes,
because,
yes, you could read it for me.
yes,
That'd be
which you
nice.
use it as the epigraph for the last chapter. And
Yeah, there
it's
we go.
all who I love are of my people. It is not simple.
Yeah, all who I love are of my people. It is not simple. And that became sort of the my closing thoughts on the whole, thing was that it is not simple. And that it's not that it's fluid. I mean, it is that it's fluid partially, but that there's no like definitive simple way to talk about it, but that we need to say more. And I feel, just that that the that construction of my people, that there's some people who are my people and then there's others who aren't my people, is like a false. It's been constructed in kind of a way that has caused these ruptures, that has been really painful, and that it's we have to be to look at who we really are, and be open to changing about it.
Yeah. Um, in one part of the book, you draw on three Jewish concepts of mistor, miklat, and makom. Can you tell us what these mean and what they mean to you in the context of this book?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you wanted to ask that question, because in a lot of contexts I don't get to talk about the Jewish aspects of
Mhm.
of this. But I really came first, but I came across this word restore in reading a book about some of the communities in Southwest Michigan. The book was A Stronger Kinship by Annalisa Cox, about the town of Covert,
Mm.
and she she talks about the was founded by abolitionists, and she talks about how they drew the name, how they chose this name Covert as it being a translation of Nistor, of a hidden place, and it's used in the Book of Esther quite a bit, like that, in that she hid herself.
Hmm.
So that kind of drew me into the biblical use of that word. And then around the same time, I was in a not whole nother uh, area. I was reading a zine by the trans activist Micah Bezant,
Hmm.
and they um, did a zine called Miklat Miklat, and it's about places of refuge, which is different than a hidden place. A me store is like a hidden place, but a refuge can be also it's a place where people hide. Um,
But it can be a
and
public place that people know as a place you can go to for refuge,
yes, yes,
like a
and
sanctuary city or something like that.
it's a sanctuary city, right? Um, and I was it, and the it just these different biblical like place descriptions of kind of places just really spoke to me as that this was um like Vandalia, like this area, these were they were so under the radar. Um, they were places of refuge and place they were hidden. And then the Macomb, just the place, was also um, really stood out to me because it's both metaphor for the place for God. It's a name for God, and it's a metaphor for like it could be any place, but it's also a place, like a physical place, and that there's these, you know, that in biblical language, it's both, you know, concrete, real. There's real places, and that there are also metaphors. So all of that just really spoke to me as I was describing this place where Aunt Rose chose to live,
Hmm.
and kind of as a place of safety for her, but also as a place where she stayed hidden.
Hmm.
And she stayed hidden even from me, even after trying to find her for so many years.
Right. You have this sense that she's kind of, as you're pursuing her, she's slipping into the shadows, kind of like, you can't find me. You're not going to pin me down.
Right. Yeah.
Um, there's also, I happen to know because my spouse is a scholar of Jewish mysticism, there's all kinds of mystical associations with the idea of hiddenness, with the term Mistor or Nistar. There's like
Yes.
hidden light and revealed, there's what's hidden and what is revealed. And that's a big mystical theme. And the other piece that doesn't fit as well into the uh, way you're using these terms and metaphors in your story, but that is of interest is that in rabbinic literature, makom not only is used to refer to God, but is also the word that's used for vagina,
I did not know that.
which is super fascinating. The
The
thing that
place.
is, it
Okay.
becomes a name for something that's not nameable, but is an important place. So I give that to you as a gift to to add into the story in some way. I'm not
Right.
sure
Well,
how that.
I'm so glad to have learned that tonight.
Um,
I had
right.
this. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad that using those words, which because I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but we do, like, we read text, and whether we're really a scholar of it or not, it all does. It we read it over and over, and it means things, and we it just changes the way we think.
Sure, right. And they sort of have different poetic resonances. And Ronnie points out, that the Jewish neighborhood that your family grew up in, St. Louis, was probably a makom, an important place, and for your immigrant family. And you write in the book about how, you talk about visiting the African American cemetery in search of Rose, but also going to the St. Louis cemetery where you have like 40 relatives and just kind of the abundance there.
Yeah, so I returned to St. Louis after I had finished writing the book, or yeah, but before it was published, but it was finished writing. But and I had been gone for 37 years, and came back, and I've just had some amazing ex- feelings of being home,
Mm,
because there are four generations of my family here, and which I feel like is unusual for, like, American Jews
yeah.
to have that many generations in a place. And so it starts to feel like this is really my place, because there's so much history here.
Hmm. And there was one question about whether you're gonna, and you said that you are continuing to research this, and I'm curious whether you feel like you have closure on this story or whether there's more writing about Rose or about your own life to come.
Well, I do want to keep writing, and I have Substack that I'm sort of I'm germinating an idea of doing some regular. I wrote this the book basically in installments in the that I published in the newspaper that I in Washington Jewish News
Hmm.
under the um, heading of Looking for Rose, and so I committed myself to writing 2,000 words, publishing 2,000 words a month for 26 months, and basically got the book out. So I don't want to do that again, but I'm thinking of doing a monthly Substack that it tells some another part of my life, you know. So
Great. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. Tell if you put in the chat what that's called, and people can check it out if they
yeah,
register
the
for your.
Substack is just under my name,
Okay.
Clare Kinberg.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for sharing your story and Rose's story with us. And thanks to all of you who joined us for this conversation. You can learn more about Claire and her work in JWA's feminism exhibit, and you can learn about Bridges in the Encyclopedia of Women on our site. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Maya Arad about her novel Happy New Year's. And until next time, take care, everybody, and let's take care of each other. Good night and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Claire.